Arizona Territory, 1879. The last crimson rays of sunset painted the rugged landscape as dust settled around Fort Apache. The uneasy peace between settlers and the Apache tribes hung as thin as the evening haze. For Frank O'Malley, the 25-year-old cowhand who'd ridden into this tension-filled outpost 3 days prior, the frontier represented freedom, freedom from attachments that would only lead to heartache. Frank adjusted his worn Stetson, brushing desert dust from his lean frame as he approached the trading post. His blue eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the perimeter with the vigilance that had kept him alive for 7 years of drifting. The scar along his jaw served as a permanent reminder of what happened when a man let his guard down in Apache territory. "Need anything else today, O'Malley?" The shopkeeper's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Coffee's all," Frank replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd survived by keeping to himself. He'd signed on with the Circle S Ranch temporarily, just long enough to earn traveling money before moving on. That was his pattern, never staying, never settling, never forming bonds that would inevitably be broken by violence or betrayal. The frontier was no place for permanence. Frank had buried that notion alongside his family's homestead when Comanche raiders torched it 6 years earlier. At 19, he'd learned that lesson in blood and fire, carrying only his father's revolver and a vow never to be vulnerable again. What he wanted was simple: earn his pay, avoid trouble, and keep riding. What he told himself he didn't need was the very thing the lonely nights on the trail made him ache for: connection, belonging, someone to share the burden of survival in this beautiful, brutal country. "Heard there's trouble brewing," the shopkeeper muttered, glancing toward the window where soldiers from the fort gathered. "Apache bands getting restless about those new mining claims pushing onto their hunting grounds. Best keep your head down, son." Frank nodded. Tribal conflicts were none of his concern. He'd steer clear, collect his wages, and vanish like morning mist over the desert. That was the cowboy way, his way. The gunshots shattered the evening calm like thunderclaps. Frank's hand instinctively found his Colt as he stepped onto the trading post porch. Down the dusty street, a wagon had been surrounded by soldiers. A family of Apache, a gray-haired man, a woman, and a younger female, stood with hands raised while an officer shouted accusations about stolen horses. "They ain't stolen, we traded fair," the older Apache man insisted in broken English. The argument intensified and Frank turned away. Not his fight, not his problem. He'd learned the hard way that inserting yourself between the army and the tribes only ended with a shallow grave. Then the young woman stepped forward. "Take me instead," she said, her voice clear and steady across the dusty street. "Let my parents go. I will answer for these false charges." Frank froze mid-step. Something in her voice, dignity amid danger, made him turn back. She couldn't have been more than 20, with jet-black hair falling in a thick braid past her waist. Unlike her parents in traditional dress, she wore a simple calico dress adapted to Apache tastes, speaking to time spent among the white settlers. Her chin lifted in defiance as she stood between the soldiers and her family. "The army doesn't negotiate with horse thieves," the lieutenant spat. "Then the army should look elsewhere," she replied, her English flawless and educated. "These horses bear the marks of fair trade. My father is White Mountain Apache, a peaceful man who has honored the treaty. I can prove our innocence if you give me the chance." The officer grabbed her arm roughly. "You'll all answer at the fort." Frank didn't remember moving. One moment he stood on the porch, the next he was striding across the street, stopping just short of the confrontation. "Lieutenant," he called, touching the brim of his hat with false deference. "Might be worth hearing the lady out." Every head turned toward him, the soldiers suspicious, the Apache family wary, but the young woman's dark eyes flashed with something that pierced Frank's carefully constructed armor. "This isn't your concern, cowboy," the lieutenant warned. "Maybe not," Frank agreed easily, though his stance suggested otherwise. "But I saw those horses when they came in yesterday, traded fair from Hendricks Remuda down south. Got his brand, but also got his burn mark on the left flank, his way of marking horses he sold legally." The lieutenant narrowed his eyes but moved to check the horses. Sure enough, the distinctive H-cross mark was there, alongside a smaller trade mark. These people wouldn't be foolish enough to steal marked horses and ride them straight through town, Frank continued reasonably. "Seems to me there's been a misunderstanding." The tension vibrated like a plucked wire before the officer reluctantly stepped back. "Get these horses and your family out of town by morning," he ordered the Apache man, saving face despite his error. As the soldiers dispersed, the older man approached Frank cautiously. "Why would you speak for Apache strangers, cowboy?" he asked, suspicion evident. Frank shrugged uncomfortably, "Just stating facts." "I am Gray Wolf. This is my wife, Morning Flower, and my daughter, Juniper." The man gestured to the young woman who now studied Frank with undisguised interest. "She carries two names, one from her mother's people, one from the school where she learned white man's ways." "Juniper Vane," she clarified, extending her hand in the white manner, though her eyes remained guarded. "My mother is White Mountain Apache. My father is half Apache, half Mexican. I attended the mission school near Tucson." Frank hesitated before taking her offered hand, noting the softness belied by calluses that spoke of hard work. "Frank O'Malley," he replied, "just passing through." "Then we are fortunate you were passing through today," she said, withdrawing her hand. Something flickered in her expression, intelligence, pride, and a complexity that didn't fit his simplified view of the world. "The horses are legitimate," Frank reiterated, already backing away, uncomfortable with their gratitude. Anyone who knows livestock could see that. "Nevertheless," Gray Wolf insisted, "you have prevented trouble for my family. We camp 3 miles north, where the stream bends through the cottonwoods. You would honor us by sharing our fire tonight." Every instinct told Frank to refuse. Getting involved with an Apache family, even one as obviously acculturated as this one, was asking for complications. But the dignity in Gray Wolf's invitation and something unnameable in Juniper's steady gaze made refusal seem churlish. "Might be I'll ride out later," he heard himself saying. Juniper's slight smile transformed her face, revealing dimples that contradicted her serious demeanor. "The cavalry rarely admits mistakes. You must have a persuasive way about you, Mr. O'Malley." "Frank," he corrected automatically, then wondered why he'd done so. He didn't plan on knowing her long enough for first names to matter. As they loaded their goods and prepared to leave town, Frank fought the inexplicable urge to follow immediately. Instead, he returned to the bunkhouse at Circle S, telling himself he'd likely not ride out to their camp at all. But as the stars emerged over the desert, Frank found himself saddling his chestnut gelding. He told himself it was simple courtesy, ensuring they'd made it safely out of town and away from any vengeful soldiers. It had nothing to do with the way Juniper Vane's voice had sounded when she'd said, "Take me instead," with such calm courage that it had cut through years of his carefully cultivated detachment. The Apache camp nestled in a small grove where cottonwoods and sycamores created a natural shelter alongside a meandering creek. As Frank approached, the smell of roasting rabbit and the soft murmur of voices guided him. Gray Wolf motioned him toward the fire without surprise, as though he'd expected Frank's arrival despite the cowboy's own uncertainty. Morning Flower offered him a wooden bowl of stew while Juniper watched him from across the flames, her expression unreadable. "You have ridden with cattle long?" Gray Wolf asked after they'd eaten in companionable silence. "Since I was 16, Frank answered, surprising himself with his willingness to share even this small detail. "Started in Texas, worked my way west." "Always moving," Juniper observed quietly, "never staying." Frank glanced up sharply, unsettled by her perception. "That's the cowboy way." "Is it?" she asked, a challenge in her voice. "Or is it your way, Mr. O'Malley?" "Frank," he reminded her, then deflected. "What about you? Mission school's a long way from traditional Apache life." A shadow crossed her face. "My parents believed I should understand both worlds. The white world changes everything it touches. To survive, one must understand it. And now," he pressed, genuinely curious, "now I help my people navigate between worlds. I translate, I negotiate, I teach the children English while ensuring they don't forget their own language." Her voice carried conviction that made Frank feel oddly rootless in comparison. "Juniper has refused marriage offers from both Apache warriors and white settlers," Gray Wolf said with obvious pride. "She says her purpose is larger than one household." "Father," she protested softly, her cheeks darkening. Morning Flower spoke in Apache and Juniper translated. "My mother says you have kind eyes behind your careful mask. She says you have lost much." Frank's hand instinctively moved to the scar on his jaw. Everyone loses out here. That's why staying unattached is safer. Safer, perhaps, Juniper conceded, but is it living? The conversation shifted to less personal topics, the changing weather, the army's increased presence, the cattle business. Yet Frank found himself watching Juniper's animated expressions as she alternated between translating for her mother and offering her own observations. Her intelligence and quiet humor revealed themselves gradually, like stars emerging after sunset. Later, as he prepared to leave, Juniper walked with him to his horse. "Why did you really intervene today?" she asked directly. Frank checked his saddle cinch, buying time. "Told you. Just stating facts about those horses." "You could have stated facts from the trading post porch," she countered, "yet you put yourself between armed soldiers and Apache. Most cowboys wouldn't risk that." The desert night had cooled considerably, and Frank could see her breath in small clouds between them. He should mount up, ride away, and return to his solitary existence. Instead, he answered truthfully. "When you said take me instead, I've never heard anyone sound so certain, so willing to sacrifice themselves." He hesitated. "Made me wonder what that feels like, to care that much about anything." Her expression softened. "It feels like purpose, Frank O'Malley, something I suspect you've been riding away from for many years." Before he could respond, she reached up and briefly touched the scar along his jawline, a gesture so unexpected that he forgot to flinch away. "My people believe scars are sacred writing, stories the body remembers when the mind would rather forget," she said quietly. "Someday, perhaps you'll share that story." She stepped back and Frank mounted, unsettled by her perception and his own unexpected response to it. As he rode away, her words echoed in his mind. "It feels like purpose." Purpose was a luxury Frank had abandoned long ago. Yet something about Juniper Vane's certainty made his carefully constructed isolation feel suddenly hollow. The next morning, Frank threw himself into ranch work with unusual vigor, hoping physical exhaustion would drive away thoughts of intelligent dark eyes and challenging questions. He was helping break a spirited Mustang when the ranch owner, Samuel Scott, called him over. "O'Malley, need you to ride into Tucson. Army contract came through, they need 30 head delivered to Fort Lowell next week. Take this paperwork to the bank there, secure the advance payment." Frank nodded, secretly relieved at the chance to put distance between himself and the inexplicable pull he felt toward the Apache camp. "I'll leave at first light." "Take the northern route," Scott advised. "Word is there's trouble brewing with some renegade Apache bands to the south, not the reservation groups, mind you, but some of the holdouts. Been raiding settlements near the Dragoons." Frank stiffened. "White Mountain Apache involved?" "Don't think so, they're peaceful enough, but soldiers don't always distinguish between friendly and hostile Indians when there's blood spilled." That evening, Frank found himself riding north again, telling himself he was simply taking a scenic route back to the bunkhouse. When he spotted smoke from the Apache camp, he convinced himself he was merely being neighborly, warning them about potential trouble. This time, only Juniper sat by the fire. She looked up without surprise as he approached. "My parents have gone to visit my mother's cousin," she explained, gesturing for him to sit. "They will return tomorrow." Frank hesitated, aware of the impropriety of being alone with her, but finally dismounted. "There's word of trouble, renegade Apache raids south of here. Army's getting jumpy." Concern crossed her features. The desperate actions of a few will bring punishment to all who share their blood. "It has always been so," she poked the fire with a stick. "Is that why you came, to warn us?" "Yes," he said, then admitted, "No, I don't rightly know why I came." Her smile was fleeting but genuine, honesty. A rare quality. She studied him openly. "You're leaving soon." "It wasn't a question, how'd you know that?" "Your kind never stays," she said matter-of-factly. "Like the wind, cowboys blow through, disturbing everything in their path before disappearing over the horizon." "My kind," he echoed, oddly stung. "Restless souls," she clarified, "those running from ghosts." Frank almost denied it, but something about the night, the vast star-filled sky, the solitude, Juniper's direct gaze, pulled truth from him like water from a desert well. "Lost my family to Comanche raiders when I was 19, he said abruptly. "Texas frontier. I was in town getting supplies, came back to smoke and bodies. Juniper didn't offer platitudes or pity, only attentive silence that somehow made continuing possible. The scar, he touched his jaw, came later, tracked the raiders for weeks, caught up to them, nearly got myself killed in the process. He stared into the fire. Killing them didn't bring my family back, didn't even bring peace. So I started drifting, figured if I never stayed anywhere, never got close to anyone, I'd never have to feel that kind of loss again. And has it worked? She asked softly. This life without connections. Frank met her gaze across the flames. Until 3 days ago, I would have said yes. Something shifted in her expression, surprise followed by wariness. Be careful, Frank O'Malley. I am not a saloon girl charmed by cowboy flattery, nor an Apache maiden dazzled by a white man's attention. Wasn't trying to flatter, he said honestly. Just answering your question. The tension between them hummed like a plucked string. Finally, she spoke again. I understand loss. My brother died at Skeleton Canyon during fighting with soldiers 4 years ago. He was 16, unarmed, in the wrong place when the army decided all Apache in the area must pay for raids committed by a few. Her voice remained steady, but Frank saw the grief beneath her composure. That is why I studied the white man's language and ways, to prevent such misunderstandings from taking more lives. Seems we both carry ghosts, Frank observed quietly. The difference, she replied, is that I do not run from mine. I let them guide my purpose. The challenge in her words hung between them as clearly as if she'd thrown down a gauntlet. Before Frank could respond, distant hoofbeats interrupted the moment. Juniper was on her feet instantly, listening with the practiced attention of someone accustomed to danger. Soldiers, she said grimly, many of them. Frank moved to stand beside her, scanning the darkness. Torches appeared in the distance, at least a dozen riders approaching fast. Army patrols don't ride at night unless there's trouble, he said. Where can your parents be found? 2 miles northeast at my aunt's camp. Fear flashed across her face. If there's been Apache trouble elsewhere. They may not distinguish between friendly and hostile, Frank finished grimly. I'll ride to warn them. I'm coming with you, she insisted, already gathering her shawl. No, Frank gripped her shoulders. If they're looking for renegades, you need to be here, visible, peaceful. If you run, they'll assume guilt. Indecision warred in her expression. My parents. I'll find them, he promised. Stay here. If questioned, say I'm bringing horses to trade. Nothing suspicious. The approaching riders were close enough now that their voices carried on the night air. Frank swung onto his gelding. Be careful, Juniper urged. They're angry about something. Their eyes held for one charged moment before Frank wheeled his horse and galloped northeast, using the creek bed to muffle his departure. He pushed his mount hard through the desert night, grateful for the bright moonlight that illuminated the terrain. Finding Gray Wolf's relatives proved easier than expected, a small cluster of traditional wickiups nestled against rocky outcroppings. The older couple emerged cautiously at his approach. Frank explained the situation in halting Spanish, which Gray Wolf's wife understood better than English. Within minutes, they had packed essential belongings and mounted their horses. We go different way, Gray Wolf insisted. Not back to camp, too dangerous if soldiers there. Your daughter is there, Frank countered. Juniper speaks white man's language, has papers from school. Soldiers will not harm educated Indian, Gray Wolf reasoned. We will circle around, watch from distance. When safe, we return. Frank wanted to argue but recognized the wisdom in their caution. He nodded reluctantly. Where will you go? There is cave and hills, we wait there. I'll return to your camp, Frank decided. Make sure Juniper is safe. Gray Wolf studied him intently. You risk much for people not your own. Frank had no answer that made sense even to himself. He simply nodded and turned his horse back toward Juniper's camp. He approached cautiously, dismounting and leading his horse the final quarter-mile. The scene that greeted him sent ice through his veins. Soldiers surrounded the camp. Juniper stood calmly by the fire, speaking with a captain, but Frank could see tension in every line of her body. He edged closer, staying hidden among the trees, straining to hear their conversation. Reports of Apache renegades in this region, the captain was saying. 3 settlers killed yesterday near Davidson's Creek. White Mountain Apache are peaceful, Juniper responded evenly. We honor the treaty. Then you won't mind accompanying us to Fort Apache while we investigate, the captain replied. It wasn't a request. My parents will return tomorrow, she said. I will gladly speak with your commanders then. Now the captain insisted. Rounding up all Apache in the area, friendly or otherwise, until we sort this out. Frank saw her shoulders stiffen. That is not lawful under the treaty. Treaty be damned, another soldier spat. Indians killed my cousin last month. All look the same to me. The captain silenced him with a sharp look, but his intentions remained clear. The soldiers would take Juniper to the fort, where she might be held indefinitely, or worse, if the raids continued and inflamed anti-Apache sentiment. Frank weighed his options rapidly. He could attempt a rescue, but that would only confirm suspicions of Apache hostility and likely get them both killed. He could follow at a distance, perhaps help her escape later, or... He stepped from the trees, approaching with his hands visible. Evening, Captain, he called easily. Having trouble with my trading partner. Every soldier turned, hands moving to weapons before identifying him as White. Juniper's eyes widened momentarily before her expression became carefully neutral. This is not your concern, Cowboy, the captain stated. Actually, it is, Frank replied with forced casualness, moving to stand beside Juniper. Miss Vane here is helping me arrange a horse trade with her father. I've put down money already. Army taking her away interferes with legitimate business. The captain frowned. You're trading with Apache. Best horses in the territory, Frank shrugged. Been arranging it for weeks, got paperwork right here. He reached slowly into his vest and produced the cattle contract from the Circle S, which he doubted any of them would examine closely enough to discern its true nature. She still needs to come to the fort for questioning, the captain insisted. Apache renegades hit Davidson's Creek settlement, 3 dead. Frank maintained his relaxed posture while his mind raced. Well now, that is serious business, but Miss Vane here was with me all yesterday, helping evaluate horses down at Circle S Ranch. The lie came easily. She couldn't have been involved. Juniper's quick intake of breath was the only indication of her surprise. To her credit, she didn't contradict him. The captain studied them both skeptically. You're vouching for her whereabouts. Absolutely, Frank confirmed. Ask Samuel Scott himself. She was at Circle S from sunup to sundown. We can ride to the fort together tomorrow if you need statements, but taking her tonight seems unnecessary. Tension stretched between them as the captain considered. Finally, he nodded curtly. First light, you both present yourselves at Fort Apache. Any delay, I'll consider it confirmation of involvement and respond accordingly. Understood, Captain, Frank agreed easily. We'll be there. The soldiers departed with obvious reluctance, several casting suspicious glances back as they rode away. Only when their torches had disappeared into the darkness did Frank exhale. They won't go far, he said quietly. Probably leave someone watching. Juniper turned to him, eyes flashing. Why did you lie? If they discover your falsehood, you could be arrested, or worse. Because they were going to take you now. Ask questions never, Frank replied simply. This buys time for your parents to get safely away. They're safe. Hiding in caves to the east, they'll stay there until this blows over. Relief softened her features momentarily before concern returned. You've entangled yourself in tribal matters that don't concern you. Why? Frank couldn't articulate the impulse that had driven him to intervene, not without admitting things he wasn't ready to acknowledge even to himself. Seemed the right thing to do, he said finally, but we need to move. Those soldiers might change their minds, come back tonight, and we can't go to the fort tomorrow. Once they check your whereabouts and find you weren't at Circle S, they'll arrest us both. Where can we go? Worry creased her brow. If they're rounding up all Apache. Frank made a quick decision. The ranch has a line shack up in the foothills, isolated. We can hide there until we figure out who's really behind these raids. You believe it wasn't Apache? Don't know, he admitted. But I know rushing to judgment gets innocent people killed. She studied him, then nodded once. I'll gather my things. Within 20 minutes, they were riding north through the moonlit desert, keeping to washes and rocky ground that would hide their tracks. Frank led them on a circuitous route, doubling back occasionally to ensure they weren't followed. The line shack appeared as a dark shadow against the hillside shortly before dawn, a crude one-room cabin with a lean-to for horses. Inside was sparse but functional, a small stove, a narrow cot, shelves with basic provisions, and a rough wooden table with 2 chairs. Not exactly the Palmer House Hotel, Frank apologized as he lit the lamp. Juniper surveyed the humble space. It's shelter, she said pragmatically, and hidden. They tended the horses in silence, both too exhausted for conversation. Frank insisted Juniper take the cot while he spread his bedroll on the floor. Despite his exhaustion, sleep eluded him as he listened to her soft breathing from across the dark room. What was he doing? He'd interfered with army business, lied to an officer, and was now hiding an Apache woman whose people were suspected of raids. Everything he'd built his life around, staying uninvolved, avoiding attachments, moving on before complications arose, had been abandoned in the span of 3 days. And for what? For a woman whose world was as separate from his as the moon from the sun, for principles he'd long ago sacrificed to survival. For the unfamiliar feeling that had awakened in his chest when she'd spoken those words that first day, "Take me instead." Frank finally drifted into uneasy sleep with these questions still circling like hawks in his mind. He awoke to the smell of coffee. Juniper had the small stove going and was heating a pot of beans she'd found on the shelves. Morning light streamed through the cabin's single window, illuminating dust motes in golden shafts. "You should have woken me," Frank said, rising stiffly from the floor. "You needed rest," she replied simply, pouring coffee into a tin cup. "The army will be searching for us by now." Frank accepted the coffee gratefully. "We'll stay here today, move at nightfall if necessary." He hesitated. "I'm sorry about all this. You'd have been better off if I'd never interfered." Juniper's dark eyes met his directly. "Would I?" "The army was taking all Apache to the fort. At least this way, my parents escaped that roundup." "For now," Frank cautioned, "this situation won't resolve itself. Someone raided that settlement, killed those people. The army won't rest until they punish someone. Whether the right someone or not," she added bitterly. They ate in contemplative silence. Afterward, Frank checked the perimeter while Juniper organized their meager supplies. The day stretched before them with nothing but waiting and worry to fill it. By late afternoon, the close quarters had created an intimacy neither had anticipated. Frank found himself sharing stories of cattle drives and frontier towns, while Juniper described life between 2 worlds, the traditional ways of her mother's people and the education that had opened doors but also set her apart. "I belong fully to neither world," she admitted as sunset painted the cabin walls gold. "Too Apache for the whites, too white for some Apache." "Seems to me you've made your own place," Frank observed. "That takes courage." She smiled slightly. "As much courage as facing down soldiers for strangers." "That wasn't courage," Frank demurred, "just foolishness probably." "Is that why you're still here?" she challenged. "Foolishness." The question hung between them, demanding an honesty Frank had avoided for days. Before he could answer, hoofbeats sounded outside. They froze, exchanging alarmed glances. Frank moved silently to the window, peering cautiously around the edge of the rough burlap curtain. "Soldiers," Juniper whispered. Frank shook his head. "Civilians, 4 men." He squinted against the fading light. "One looks familiar." "From the trading post." "What would they want here?" "Nothing good," Frank replied grimly, reaching for his rifle. "Stay inside." He stepped onto the small porch, rifle held casually but ready. The 4 riders approached slowly, taking measure of the lone cowboy before them. "Afternoon," Frank called. "You boys lost." The lead rider, a hard-faced man with a distinctive red beard, reined in his horse. "Not lost, looking for someone. Heard there might be an Apache woman up this way." Frank's expression revealed nothing. "That's so, can't help you there. I'm just minding the line shack for Circle S while checking fence lines." "Funny," Redbeard replied without humor. "Jackson here says he saw you in town 3 days ago, interfering when the army had some Apache troublemakers surrounded." The man called Jackson, whom Frank now recognized from the trading post, nodded. "That's him all right. Mighty friendly with those Indians." "Still don't see how I can help you," Frank said evenly. "If you're looking for Apache, the reservation's 30 miles east." Redbeard spat tobacco juice. Don't play dumb, cowboy. Army's got patrols out searching for renegades, and for the girl who was supposed to report to the fort this morning but never showed. Figured we'd do our civic duty, help find her. Very public-spirited of you, Frank remarked dryly. But as you can see, it's just me here. Mind if we look inside? Redbeard's question carried obvious threat. Frank shifted slightly, blocking the door more effectively. Actually, I do mind. Private property. 3 settlers dead, mister, another rider called. Women and children among them. You harboring Indian killers makes you no better than them. The confrontation teetered on violence. Frank weighed his options, acutely aware of Juniper's vulnerability inside the cabin. He could try shooting his way clear, but 4-to-1 odds promised only death. The cabin door opened behind him. I am here, Juniper said clearly, stepping onto the porch beside Frank, but I am not what you seek. Frank wanted to curse her recklessness but kept his focus on the armed men before them. There she is, Jackson crowed. Told you. I am Juniper Vane, she continued steadily. Educated at Tucson Mission School, I speak 4 languages and serve as translator for Indian affairs. I was nowhere near Davidson's Creek during those terrible murders. Redbeard's eyes narrowed. Pretty speech for an Apache. Still doesn't explain why you're hiding out with this cowboy instead of reporting to the fort as ordered. Because the Army is arresting innocent Apache on suspicion alone, she replied. Would you surrender yourself voluntarily if you knew injustice awaited you? Justice is what awaits Indian raiders, Redbeard snarled, and those who help them. His hand moved toward his holstered pistol. Frank's rifle came up instantly. That would be unwise, he said softly. Tension crackled like heat lightning. 4 against 2, poor odds, but Frank's aimed rifle gave them momentary advantage. You'd die for an Apache? Jackson asked incredulously. I'd die for innocence, Frank replied, and unlike you, I'm not convinced of guilt without evidence. Redbeard laughed without mirth. Evidence, the evidence is her blood, Apache kill. Always have. So do white men, Juniper countered. Yet not all white men are murderers. Why condemn all Apache for the actions of a few? Enough talk, Redbeard decided. We're taking her to town. Step aside, cowboy, and you might ride away from this. Frank held steady. Can't do that. Then you'll die here. Redbeard's hand closed on his pistol grip. The rifle shot cracked across the hillside like thunder. But it wasn't Frank who fired. From the ridgeline above the cabin, another shot split the air. Redbeard's hat flew off as the bullet grazed it. The men wheeled their horses, searching for this new threat. Next one goes through your head, called a familiar voice. Gray Wolf emerged from the rocks, rifle aimed. Behind him, 3 more Apache men appeared, all armed. The odds had suddenly shifted. Redbeard and his companions found themselves caught in a potential crossfire. Seems we're at an impasse, Frank observed mildly. You could try fighting your way out, but I don't like your chances. Or you could ride away now, tell folks you didn't find anyone up here. Redbeard's face contorted with fury and fear. This isn't over, he snarled, but signaled his men to retreat. They backed their horses away before wheeling and galloping down the trail. When they disappeared from sight, Frank lowered his rifle, his heart hammering against his ribs. Juniper touched his arm briefly, a gesture of gratitude or comfort, before moving to greet her father. You should not have exposed yourself, Gray Wolf scolded his daughter gently. I couldn't let them threaten Frank for my sake, she replied simply. Gray Wolf turned to Frank. You have proven yourself a true friend to my family. But those men will return with more. We need to clear Juniper's name, Frank said. Find out who really raided that settlement. I know already, Gray Wolf replied grimly. Not Apache. White men disguised as Apache, a trick as old as the frontier. My brother's son tracked them, saw them change from painted warriors to ordinary cowboys 10 miles from Davidson's Creek. Who? Frank demanded. He could not get close enough to see faces. But they rode toward town, not the mountains where Apache would hide. Frank's mind worked rapidly. Redbeard seemed mighty determined to find Juniper, almost as if he knew exactly where to look. If they staged the raid, Juniper reasoned, they'd want all Apache suspected. They wouldn't want anyone questioning their story. which means they'd be particularly interested in silencing an educated Apache woman who might speak out, Frank concluded. We need proof. Gray Wolf nodded gravely. My nephew follows their trail still, but without white man's testimony, no one will believe Apache witness. A plan began forming in Frank's mind, dangerous, potentially suicidal, but the only way to protect Juniper and her family from the consequences of a massacre they didn't commit. I need to get into town, he decided. Listen to talk, see if anyone knows who Red Beard and his friends really are. Too dangerous, Juniper protested. They'll be watching for you. Not if I come in from the south like I've been away, Frank countered. No one except those four connect me directly to you. To everyone else, I'm just a cowboy who spoke up once but then disappeared on ranch business. Gray Wolf considered this. My people will keep Juniper safe while you go. But take care, men who murder innocents and blame others will not hesitate to kill again. Frank nodded grimly. I'll leave at nightfall. The hours until darkness passed in tense preparation. Juniper helped Frank devise a story to explain his absence from the ranch, while Gray Wolf shared what little information his nephew had gathered about the false raiders. As Frank prepared to leave, Juniper followed him to where his horse was tethered. Why are you doing this? She asked quietly. You could ride away, leave Arizona territory entirely. This isn't your fight. Frank checked his saddle cinch, buying time as he searched for words to explain something he barely understood himself. Been riding away my whole life, he finally said, running from attachments, from putting down roots, from caring enough about anything that losing it would hurt. He met her gaze directly. Maybe I'm tired of running. And what happens after? She pressed. If we survive this, you return to drifting and I to my place between worlds. The question pierced him with its honesty and the longing it barely concealed. Frank took a step toward her, close enough to see the flecks of amber in her dark eyes. I don't know, he admitted. Only know I can't ride away this time. Her hand rose to touch his cheek, featherlight against the scar that marked his past. Be careful, Frank O'Malley. I find I'm no longer indifferent to your fate. The simple declaration, so restrained yet so profound, struck him more powerfully than any passionate declaration could have. Before he could respond, she stepped back, composure restored. Return safely, she said simply. We will await you here. Frank rode through the night, circling wide around Fort Apache to approach the town from the south. His mind replayed Juniper's words and the touch of her fingers against his scar. For the first time in years, he found himself contemplating a future beyond the next cattle drive or payday, a dangerous indulgence when his immediate task carried such risk. He reached town shortly after dawn, deliberately riding down the main street as if he had nothing to hide. At the Circle S office, he reported to Samuel Scott, explaining his delayed return with a story about banking complications in Tucson. Army's been asking about you, Scott informed him, frowning. Something about vouching for an Apache woman. Frank feigned mild surprise, had a misunderstanding with some soldiers, nothing serious. Scott looked unconvinced but didn't press. Well, stay clear of Indian troubles, got enough problems with these raids stirring everyone up. In the saloon that evening, Frank nursed a whiskey while keeping his ears open. The settlement buzzed with rumors of Apache hostilities and Army patrols. He recognized Jackson seated with several men in the corner, but Red Beard was notably absent. Frank positioned himself close enough to overhear their conversation. Rollins says they'll try again tomorrow, one man was saying. Those hills are full of hiding places. Army should just clean 'em all out, another grumbled. Only good Apache is a... Shut up, Jackson hissed suddenly. Cowboy at the bar, that's O'Malley, the one who was hiding the Indian girl. Frank pretended not to notice as conversation at their table died. He paid for his drink and sauntered out casually, though every nerve screamed danger. Outside, he mounted his horse as if heading back to the ranch, then circled around to take position near the saloon's rear exit. His patience was rewarded an hour later when Jackson and his companions emerged. Frank followed at a distance as they rode to a small ranch outside town. There, illuminated by lantern light, he saw Red Beard, whose real name appeared to be Rollins, addressing several men. Frank crept closer, straining to hear. Land will be worthless if the Army extends the reservation, Rollins was saying. We need those Apache troublemakers locked down tight, or better yet, shipped to Florida with the Chiricahua prisoners. Army scouring the hills, someone replied. They'll find them. Not good enough, Rollins insisted. That educated squaw could expose everything if she talks to the right people. Indian Affairs already suspected the raid wasn't Apache work. So what's the plan? Torch the Apache camps in Secret Valley tomorrow night. Make it look like they're gathering for war, Army'll do the rest. Frank had heard enough. He retreated silently to his horse and rode hard toward the hills, mind racing. Secret Valley housed several peaceful Apache families, including Juniper's relatives. Rollins planned to murder them all to cover his initial deception and seize contested grazing lands. The night was well advanced by the time Frank reached the line shack. Gray Wolf, Juniper, and the others listened grimly to his report. We must warn the families in Secret Valley, Juniper insisted. Get them to safety before tomorrow night. And then what? Frank asked. Even if they escape this attack, Rollins won't stop. He needs Apache blamed for those murders to get what he wants. We need proof, Gray Wolf said. Proof White Eyes will accept. Frank nodded slowly. There is one way. He outlined a dangerous plan that made Juniper pale. No, she protested, too risky if captured. It's our only chance to prove who really killed those settlers, Frank insisted. Otherwise, your people will always be blamed. Through the night they debated and refined the plan. By morning they had settled on their desperate strategy. Frank would return to town, apparently cooperating with the Army's search for the missing Apache woman. Meanwhile, Gray Wolf and his men would evacuate Secret Valley. The most dangerous role fell to Juniper, who insisted on positioning herself to witness Rollins' attack, accompanied by one of Gray Wolf's most trusted warriors. If all went as planned, they would secure the evidence needed while Frank brought Army officers to catch Rollins in the act. As they prepared to separate each to their assigned tasks, Frank found a moment alone with Juniper. This isn't what I wanted, he said quietly, putting you in danger. She adjusted the man's clothing she donned for camouflage, her cousin's buckskins that would help her blend into the landscape. It is my choice, she reminded him. My people, my responsibility. Still, he hesitated. If anything happens. Juniper silenced him by stepping forward and pressing her lips to his, briefly but with unmistakable intent. When she pulled back, her eyes held both determination and tenderness. For luck, she said softly. Among my mother's people, a kiss carries power, the breath of one spirit strengthening another. Frank stood momentarily speechless, the warmth of her lips lingering on his. Then we should both be very strong indeed, he finally managed. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. Return with the army by midnight, we will have your proof. They parted ways as the sun climbed over the eastern mountains. Frank rode toward Fort Apache rather than town, taking the calculated risk that appealing directly to the commanding officer would yield better results than trying to convince local law enforcement. At the fort, he requested an audience with Captain Wilson, the officer who had confronted Juniper at her camp. After an hour's wait, he was escorted into the captain's office. O'Malley, Wilson acknowledged coldly. You have nerve showing your face here after harboring a fugitive. Not harboring, sir, Frank corrected respectfully. Protecting an innocent woman from men who murdered settlers and blamed it on Apache. The captain's expression remained skeptical, but he motioned for Frank to continue. For the next 20 minutes, Frank laid out everything they'd discovered. Rollins' plan to seize contested grazing lands by inflaming anti-Apache sentiment, the false raid, and the planned attack on Secret Valley that night. That's quite a tale, Wilson said when he'd finished. Conveniently absolves your Apache friends of any wrongdoing. I'm not asking you to take my word, Frank replied. I'm offering to show you proof tonight. Catch Rollins and his men in the act. And if this is a trap, leading Army soldiers into an ambush. I'll be riding with you, Frank pointed out, first to die if it's an ambush. Wilson considered this. Where is the Apache woman now? Frank hesitated. Safe. She'll testify to Indian Affairs if Rollins is captured. After long deliberation, Wilson agreed to take a small detachment to Secret Valley that night. Whether he believed Frank's story or simply saw an opportunity to capture renegades remained unclear, but but Frank had achieved his immediate goal. The hours until nightfall passed with excruciating slowness. Frank forced himself to appear calm as he accompanied Wilson and 12 soldiers on the ride to Secret Valley. His thoughts continually strayed to Juniper, positioned somewhere on the valley's rim, watching and waiting for Rollins' men. They reached their destination shortly before 11, concealing themselves among the rocks overlooking the small cluster of Apache dwellings below. The camps appeared deserted. Gray Wolf had successfully evacuated the families, but Rollins wouldn't discover that until he moved in for his attack. "If nothing happens by midnight, O'Malley, you'll be under arrest," Wilson warned. Frank nodded tensely, eyes scanning the moonlit valley. Just when he feared the plan had somehow failed, movement caught his attention, riders approaching stealthily from the west, at least 8 men. "There," Frank whispered, pointing. Wilson raised his field glasses. "I see them, but they could be Apache raiders." "Watch," Frank instructed. As the riders drew nearer, they dismounted short of the camp. In the clear moonlight, their actions became visible, white men applying paint to their faces and bodies, affixing feathers to their hats, donning items of Apache clothing over their own. "My God," Wilson muttered. "They're disguising themselves as Apache." "Just as they did at Davidson's Creek," Frank confirmed, ready to burn these homes and blame it on renegades gathering for war. Wilson signaled his men. They moved into position as Rollins' disguised gang approached the dwellings with torches. "Halt in the name of the United States Army," Wilson's command rang out across the valley. What followed was chaos. Rollins and his men scattered, some firing wildly as they ran for their horses. The soldiers returned fire with more discipline. Frank caught glimpses of Juniper and her companion on the opposite ridge, witnessing everything as planned. 3 of Rollins' men fell in the initial exchange, 2 more surrendered immediately. The others, including Rollins himself, managed to mount and flee eastward. "After them," Wilson ordered, leaving 2 men to secure the prisoners. The pursuit lasted nearly an hour before they cornered Rollins and his remaining men in a box canyon. Realizing they were trapped, most surrendered, all except Rollins, who made a desperate break for freedom, firing as he rode. Frank spurred his horse forward, intercepting Rollins before he could reach the canyon's narrow exit. They collided hard, both men tumbling from their mounts in a tangle of dust and curses. Rollins recovered first, drawing a knife as he lunged. White-hot pain seared across Frank's ribs as the blade found its mark. He stumbled backward, hand going to his side and coming away wet with blood. Rollins advanced, triumph in his eyes. "Should have minded your own business, cowboy," he snarled, preparing for a killing thrust. The shot cracked from the ridge above. Rollins jerked, a look of surprise replacing his murderous grin as he crumpled to the ground. Frank looked up to see Juniper standing on the canyon rim, rifle still trained on Rollins' motionless form. Even at this distance, their eyes met in silent communication before she disappeared into the darkness. By morning, the full story had emerged. Rollins, real name Edward Rollins, had organized the false raid on Davidson's Creek to pressure the army into removing Apache families from lands he and his associates coveted for cattle grazing. The 3 surviving members of his gang confessed under questioning, providing written statements that cleared the Apache of all involvement. Frank's wound required stitches but wasn't life-threatening. As he sat on the fort's infirmary porch the following afternoon, Captain Wilson approached with news. "Indian Affairs is sending an investigator," he reported. "Based on the evidence and confessions, all Apache detained during our sweeps will be released." He hesitated, then added gruffly, "You were right, O'Malley. We owe you an apology." "Not me," Frank corrected. "The Apache you wrongfully suspected." Wilson nodded uncomfortably. "The woman, Juniper Vane, tell her she's free to return, no charges." "If I see her," Frank replied noncommittally. After Wilson departed, Frank made his painful way to his horse. The Apache families were returning to Secret Valley under army escort, their names cleared. Gray Wolf had sent word that all were safe. But of Juniper there had been no message. Frank rode slowly into the hills, his side throbbing with each hoofbeat. He told himself he was merely checking that all was well before continuing on his way. The Circle S had already paid his wages. Nothing held him to Arizona territory now that the danger had passed. Yet as he approached the line shack where they'd hidden together, he found himself hoping, against all his drifter's instincts, that she might be waiting. The cabin stood empty, the ashes in the stove long cold. Frank sat heavily on the single chair, exhaustion and disappointment washing over him. What had he expected? That she would abandon her people, her purpose, to follow a restless cowboy with no roots and no direction. The door opened, flooding the dim interior with afternoon sunlight. Juniper stood silhouetted against the brightness, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. For a long moment, neither spoke. "You're wounded," she finally said, moving toward him with concern. "It's nothing," he replied, drinking in the sight of her. "Your father, the others." Safe, returning to their homes. She knelt beside his chair, gentle fingers exploring the bandage visible beneath his torn shirt. "You could have been killed." "Worth the risk," he said simply. "Your shot saved my life." A shadow crossed her face. "I've never killed a man before." Frank covered her hand with his. "You saved innocent lives." "Including mine." She nodded slowly, accepting this truth. "The army is allowing our people to return unmolested. The investigator from Indian Affairs has promised changes in how accusations against Apache are handled in future." "You achieved your purpose," Frank observed. "Made things better for your people." "One step," she agreed, "many more needed." She studied him with those perceptive eyes. "And you, will you ride on now as cowboys do?" The question hung between them, weighty with possibility. Frank had asked himself the same thing repeatedly since Rollins' capture. The familiar urge to move on, to avoid attachment, still whispered at the edges of his consciousness. Yet something stronger had taken root during these dangerous days. "Depends," he said carefully. "On what?" "On whether there's reason to stay." He met her gaze directly. "On whether someone might want me to stay." Juniper's expression softened. "And if that someone has responsibilities to her people? Work that cannot be abandoned." "Then maybe that someone needs a partner," Frank suggested, heart hammering harder than during any gunfight. "Someone to help build bridges between worlds." Hope bloomed in her eyes. "Even if it means putting down roots, abandoning the drifter's life." Frank reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Even then," he smiled slightly. "Besides, someone once suggested I've been running from purpose. Maybe I've finally found it. With an Apache woman caught between worlds." The question held vulnerability beneath its challenge. "With you," Frank corrected, "the woman who said take me instead and showed more courage than any person I've ever known." Juniper's smile dawned slowly, transforming her face, and it seemed to Frank, the very air between them. "My father says you have the heart of an Apache warrior beneath your cowboy exterior." "High praise," Frank murmured, drawing her closer. "The highest," she agreed as their lips met. The kiss deepened, carrying promises neither had dared voice until now. When they finally parted, Juniper rested her forehead against his. "Stay," she whispered. "Help me build something here, not fully Apache, not fully white, but something new. Something ours." The last of Frank's resistance melted away. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. Prejudice, cultural differences, and the frontier's harsh realities would challenge them daily. But for the first time since watching his family's homestead burn, he wanted to build rather than run, to create rather than merely survive. "I'll stay," he promised, sealing the words with another kiss. 6 months later, Frank stood nervously before the small gathering assembled outside the newly constructed cabin. The homestead, built on land purchased with his savings and situated carefully between white settlement and Apache territory, represented everything he'd once feared. Permanence, commitment, roots. Gray Wolf approached, resplendent in traditional Apache ceremonial attire. "Are you ready, my son?" he asked in the Apache language Frank had been diligently learning. Frank nodded, his newly tailored suit feeling strange after years of trail clothes. "Ready," he confirmed. The small crowd, a mix of Apache family members and a few trusted whites, including Samuel Scott, parted as Juniper appeared. She wore a dress that blended white wedding traditions with Apache decorative elements, her mother's turquoise jewelry complementing the simple white fabric. Her black hair flowed loose, adorned with a single white flower. As she reached him, Frank took her hands in his. The ceremony that followed combined Apache traditions with Christian elements, performed partly in Apache, partly in English. Neither fully one world nor the other, but something new, forged from both. When they were pronounced husband and wife, Frank kissed his bride as cheers erupted from both cultures. In her eyes he saw the same wonder he felt, that two people with such different beginnings could find such common purpose. Later, as evening fell and the celebration continued around them, they stood together on the porch of their new home. Beyond the flickering firelight, the Arizona desert stretched vast and beautiful beneath a canopy of stars. "Any regrets, Cowboy?" Juniper asked softly, nestled against his side. Frank shook his head, arm tightening around her waist. "Not one." She smiled up at him, and the drifting life, the open trail. "Got all the freedom I need right here," he answered truthfully, "and something I never found on the trail, a home." As their guests danced and celebrated the union of two worlds, Frank O'Malley, former drifter, now rancher, translator, and bridge builder, finally understood the truth Juniper had tried to teach him from the beginning. True courage wasn't found in facing down gunfighters or surviving alone on the frontier. It lay in opening your heart despite past wounds, in building connections when everything in you screamed to run. "Take me instead," she had said that fateful day, willing to sacrifice herself for family. In the end, they had both chosen something larger than themselves, a life together that might, in its small way, help heal the divisions of the frontier. And in that choice they had found everything neither knew they were seeking.